the first blow!
Threat eliminated.
We're 6 videos deep into coverage of the SaGa series now. I wanted to expand my horizons when I first covered the WonderSwan version of the first game, and in doing so, I dipped my toes into actually making video reviews. Several years and 5 SaGa videos later, I'm now a big fan of the series, so let's see how Scarlet Grace Ambitions holds up from the perspective of a SaGa fan. Scarlet Grace's campaigns are divided between 4 characters. When you first start the game up, you're presented with a questionnaire, and depending on how you answer the questions, the game gives you one of 4 protagonists to start off with. If you don't like what the game presents to you, you're allowed to cancel out of the result and choose for yourself. The questionnaire system is there to remove choice paralysis from the start of the game, which is a great idea. It's pretty unfair how you're often expected to make the biggest decisions on how to play an RPG before you understand how anything works in most other games. You have overwhelmingly huge odds of landing one of 2 characters, Erpina or Leonard. Erpina being the most beginner-friendly character of the game, kind of like Albert in Romancing SaGa 1 or Julius in Romancing SaGa 3. And Leonard gets the most freedom compared to everyone else. There's still a small chance you can get the other 2 characters, Taria or Balmaint, but it feels like you have to try to get them. You almost have to game the system for it to give you them. It feels unfair, but I heard that Taria actually has the harder endgame, and Balmaint is so railroaded that he's not representative of a normal playthrough, so it does make some sense for the game to not push you into them as a new player. So let's go over the characters before moving on.
While I may be young, I shall still do all I can for House Gelanius.
Erpina Gelanius is the princess of the House of Swords. She travels the lands in search of her father, with her homeland one of the last remaining great houses of a failed empire threatening to fall. She sets out to try and keep her family's legacy alive, while also being as diplomatic and polite as she can in an uncaring world. Erpina is the perfect starting character, being balanced in the middle of a freeform campaign and a linear one. Her campaign is structured into 3 chapters. The first one being her introduction, where her father leaves the country and she sets out to find him when she realizes that he's not coming back. In this chapter, you get locked in a region until you've done what the story asks of you, usually something to do with a giant serpent popping up out of nowhere, and then you move on to the next region. Her second and third chapters can both be filled in with one of 3 general quests. So, after one playthrough of Erpina, you'll always have one of the 3 main quests left untouched for a replay as another character. Of course, with the way that the game presents this, you can play through the entire campaign and not even be aware that things work this way, since the quests start the second that you enter their region, making all 3 of them feel like the intended path you were supposed to take all along. Once one of them has started, you're still free to go out and explore the rest of the world as you please, with tons of side quests open to mess around with.
I'll need to grow up fast if I'm gonna drown the scarlet shards in Ihana.
Leonard is a farmer who one day finds a girl holding a scarlet shard. She asks him to gather the scarlet shards and drown them in Ihana, a mythical place most people only know about from children's bedtime stories. The scarlet shard bugs him. He's normally not one for caring about grandiose things, but he was always told he was found clutching one as a little baby. So, believing this might be his destiny or whatever, Leo and his childhood friend Elizabeth set out to drown the scarlet shards in Ihana, except they don't know where Ihana is. They don't know much about the world out there in general. And nobody takes their quest seriously since it's clearly just a children's fairy tale. So Leo and Lissa just blunder into everything all at once like a bunch of hooligans, causing mayhem wherever they go. Consequences are someone else's problem, not Leo or Lissa's. Leo gets complete freedom. Technically, his story is divided into 2 chapters, the intro lasting until you find out the truth about Ihana. But even during his intro, you're free to go wherever you want, and all the other major quests already open up whenever you enter a region. Leo probably does not even know what a chapter is, but he knows a problem when he sees one, and with Lissa's help, he deals with all the major quests that Erpina could potentially also face, at the same time. It can be pretty overwhelming because this lack of structure also means you're going to run into combat you're not ready for yet at every turn. So you go to another region to start questing around there until maybe you run into the same problem there, or you just run into quests you don't feel like bothering with right now. So eventually you'll have so many quests in so many regions, you lose track of it all. It's great, I actually really like this. Now, I'll be honest, the next two characters I haven't played as yet, but I know parts of their quests from my other playthroughs, and I know the characters decently enough to know what their deal is. I'll go into the how or why a bit later on, but for now we'll just continue with the rest of the character introductions.
Siegfried said he would reincarnate 7 times. I have a hard time believing that, and yet...
Balmaint is an executioner. He treats his job with care and respect, making sure all the people he executes for his homeland receive the dignity that they deserve. One day, a political leader, Siegfried, was caught and brought to justice. In his dying words, Siegfried said he'd be resurrected 7 times and bring his justice to the world. Sometime after his execution, rumors start spreading of Siegfried being seen elsewhere, so Balmaint sets out to investigate the matter, to find Siegfried and execute him 7 more times. Balmaint's campaign is almost entirely linear. He goes to where Siegfried has been rumored to have appeared in and investigates matters there. It puts him at the opposite end of the amount of freedom you get compared to Leo.
Why is my pottery warped so? I must discover the reason.
Taria is a pottery girl who moved to a secluded area surrounded by mountains so she could focus on her pottery work. However, through her pottery she senses there's disturbances in the world and decides that because of this, she can't continue as is. So she sets out on a journey to stop whatever is messing up her pottery work. She's secretly a witch in hiding, and all the things leading to the possible revival of the Firebringer are likely causing the disturbances that cause her lack of focus. Though the one thing she zones in on is the arrival of the Phoenix in her area. Taria's story works a lot like Urpina's. After the Phoenix quest, you have 2 more chapters where you can choose out of 3 possible quests. All 4 protagonists get their own overworld theme, combat theme, and screen borders during event scenes. It's really cool. One of the things that Scarlet Grace does with its story is that there are 4 main quests in the game. Each of the 4 main characters starts off with a different one, while usually still allowing them to experience at least some of the other quests to some extent. Urpina faces the Earth Serpents, Leo collects Scarlet Shards, Taria chases the Phoenix, and Balmaint has to deal with Siegfried. Their take on the quest that they start off with tends to have them be more personally involved, often unveiling some more truths about the world that the game takes place in. For as disjointed as the main story quests can feel while playing as the individual characters, they're mostly campaigns that exist within the shared world, that when explored more, gives you more of an understanding of the setting. This is pretty typical of SaGa games, but Scarlet Grace drives it a bit further than the other titles I've covered so far. There being less characters, each with a wider range of changes in scripts and content, probably helps with that. As Urpina, you see how the major houses left over from the Empire all hate each other up close, and how they will continue tearing each other down even after their glory days are done. Believing that if the other houses are dealt with, they can seize control of their lands and create their own new version of the Empire. As Leo, you learn more about how the Empire itself wasn't all that rosy either, for as much as was lost when the Empire fell, even more was lost to make way for its foundation to begin with. It's kind of a bleak setting when it comes down to it, but it is one that's interesting to learn about. And judging from a lot of the minor quests scattered through the game, a lot of the common folk will probably be fine living their own lives, instead of clinging to things that cannot last. It makes me wonder if this setting comes from Akitoshi Kawazu reflecting on his time at Square. He was there for the early days of Final Fantasy. In fact, his first game for the company was Rad Racer on the NES. He worked on the original Final Fantasy, and a lot of modern Final Fantasy fans still hate the game that first experimented with a lot of the things that would later be polished and be used more appropriately in SaGa, Final Fantasy II. Most of the staff from the early days are gone, and Square's heyday came and went as the merger with Enix brought Yoichi Wada to the forefront. Kawazu has seen the days before the rise itself, and the fall, as well as the current new upward trend in his time. which, if my read on this is right, would make Kawazu the Firebringer, someone important, more important with the company's legacy than people realize, who comes back every now and again to release that less popular series, often vilified for an early blunder. The Firebringer himself is an interesting case too. He's the main antagonist, but he doesn't make any real appearances during a playthrough until the very end. But all the seemingly disconnected main quests all tie back to his impending return. It's like he's in the background of the entire setting, just waiting to show up. Kind of like how he blends into the whites behind him in the background in most of the promotional art that he's in. Scarlet Grace's presentation is like that of a tabletop game. There's a lot of pop-up book elements where towns, caves, and areas of note pop up when you get near them. And the buttons at the bottom of the screen showing you what you can do there scream tabletop inspired to me. They're very close to what strategy games do on PC when they invoke tabletop design. The main way you progress quests is through events, and there's two types of events: cutscenes and combat.
You're cruising for a bruising.
Combat is the real meat of Scarlet Grace, and unlike a lot of the other entries that I've covered, it's a lot less avoidable this time around. Which is a good thing, because this might be my new favorite combat system in any turn-based RPG, let alone a SaGa game. Before you enter a fight, you can see the amount of combat encounters you have to win to clear the event. You have to do these back-to-back in one go, though the game is not that harsh about it. Before every encounter, you get a chance to change your lineup, equipment, and formations, so if you need to swap someone out or change your strategy up, you get a chance before every fight. Combat itself is deceptively straightforward. There's a turn order at the bottom of the screen, and you select which characters do what attacks directly on there. Sounds simple enough. Turn order displays like this have been normal ever since Final Fantasy X made it popular to show it that way. But there's a catch. Battle points, or BP, are global across the entire party, and every attack, even the basic ones, costs BP to use. So you typically start with less BP than it would take to have the entire party do their basic attacks. At the end of every turn, your BP not only refreshes, but the total amount increases by 1. So the longer the fight goes on, the more of your skills you can make your characters do. It gives fights this interesting sense of escalation that you normally don't get in JRPGs, where the fights start with the small attacks and build towards bigger moves being done more frequently over time, instead of opening on the big moves until you're out of your resources. The same build-up happens on the enemy side too. Although you can't see it, your enemies deal with the same BP restrictions that you do, with their abilities having a BP cost that is deducted from the total, a total that is slowly rising during the course of the fight. In most games, this would mean you should use your faster characters to take out the enemy's faster characters to control the flow of the fight, since the faster characters typically get to have their way with combat, but almost every mechanic in Scarlet Grace prohibits that. And it really is a game where you have to be mindful of the mechanics to get ahead. The biggest mechanic that the game builds itself on are the united attacks. Whenever an enemy is wedged between at least two of your characters on the timeline and then dies, the characters who are rejoined by that enemy's removal come together for a big attack on a random enemy. On top of that, everyone who was in the united attack gets a massive reduction in BP cost for their abilities in the next turn. So even if the united attack doesn't do that much damage, it can still be worth it, just for the BP reduction alone. Okay, that's not the full extent of how this works. If anyone dies on either side, and it unites characters of the same team together, by having that character removed from the timeline, it causes a united attack. So not only are enemies capable of doing united attacks as well, they can do united attacks if you accidentally kill the middle enemy in a row of 3 or bigger. At the same time, if one of your party members was surrounded by the rest of the party on both sides and goes down, that's a free united attack as well. And yeah, characters dying from a united attack can cause a united attack too. This is all still pretty simple and fun, but tons of other mechanics still come into play with this system too.
Me first? Very well.
Learn your lesson.
For instance, a lot of the weapon skills in the game take different amounts of time to use. So they'll move you around on the timeline if you use them. Some attacks have a delay effect that moves an enemy back in the turn order after being hit by it. Like my absolute favorite attack animation, the brusque slash. So the turn order isn't absolute. There's still a lot of leniency to it that gives the game a lot more strategic element in play. You can wedge your own characters in between enemies to either prevent or cause united attacks. You can move enemies outside of their group so you can safely kill them without prompting an enemy united attack. There's a lot of stuff like this going on, and it's all really cool.
Oh, what a great feeling! An offensive technique, perhaps? Thank you! This'll work! Yes, I did it!
There's interrupts, which are skills that will wait for incoming attacks of certain damage types to happen before jumping in and literally interrupting them. Some of these have a chance to delay the enemy attack or give the enemy a status effect, disabling them from doing whatever it was that they wanted to do. Counters work on a similar premise, but they only go off when the character performing them is directly attacked by the enemy. Both of these can be quelled by ranged attacks. And you can see enemies are about to go for interrupts or counters because they'll have question marks over their positional markers on the timeline. But even then, it's still a gamble. Is it going to be an interrupt hoping for a certain attack to happen? Or is it a counter that you're letting yourself get baited into with a ranged attack? There's always weapon skills that help cover damage while increasing the likelihood that it gets blocked, which is often useful when you're not sure about these situations, so you cover for the person who is sending out the ranged attack. Interrupts and counters have a tendency to move the character doing them next to the enemy they're disrupting on the timeline, adding more timeline manipulation to the mix, even from the enemy side if they can get a move off. Oh, and interrupts and counters can also be interrupted. They're not exempt from their own rules. This is also why you don't want everyone on your party to be too fast, because if one of your characters is about to quell an interruption, it won't be quelled until their attack has successfully done so. So any party member moving faster than the ranged attack neutralizes the effect can still trigger the effect. New attacks are randomly sparked depending on certain factors, like most of the series. Although, unlike most of the series, sparking new abilities happens after performing the one that you chose, so you no longer run the chance of being screwed over by the only attack you really needed to do being replaced by something else at random. Attacks all have their own inherent BP cost, and ranking them up lowers their base cost for future use. So, if you use abilities enough, they'll eventually become cheaper to use, which is a nice way of keeping a more long-term power scaling thing going on during a playthrough. It also gives you an extra incentive to use more expensive attacks after a united attack, because if they rank up, they're going to cost less for normal use later.
Hey, wanna see my power? No need to thank me.
Spellcasters do their own thing, which took me a while to figure out. You don't spark new spells during combat, and you don't buy them in stores this time around. Instead, after every battle a magic user participates in, they get a chance to channel Flux into one of their existing spells. Once you've channeled enough Flux, you either spark the next spell of that element or rank up the spell you're channeling it into. Ranking a spell up lowers its BP cost, making it easier to cast in the future. Spells have cast timers instead of being used immediately, so not tying their rank to use is a good thing because sometimes you'll choose a spell and then have to wait 2 turns for it to go off, by which time you'll have one already. Also, united attacks don't just decrease the BP cost of spells, but they also decrease the cast timer if you start casting them the next turn, which makes spellcasters a lot more useful and powerful once you figure out how to use that to your advantage. Life points, or LP, make their return again. When a character is knocked out during combat, they lose 1 life point. Characters placed outside of the active party slowly regain life points. So it's always good to have at least 1 or 2 combat-ready participants ready on the sidelines as replacements. It's a pretty light restriction, and I never really ran into issues with content being unclearable due to running with substitutes. Subbing someone out for a few fights isn't going to disrupt your party too much, and the substitute characters can quickly rise up to your party's power level thanks to how scaling works in Scarlet Grace. Scarlet Grace has a form of battle rank or event rank or whatever you want to call it, though it's not as aggressive as you'd think upon hearing that it's there. There's some formula going on in the background where every so many points or so, combat encounters increase in strength, and when they do, your characters also gain more stats from having fought the stronger enemies, and you get more materials for crafting better equipment. I'll be honest, I never really noticed much of it. You don't get enemy group escalation as noticeable as the Romancing SaGa entries. Supposedly, the rate at which rank increases gets slowed down for repeat battles, so if you want to hit up the mines on the overworld to farm materials, the game isn't going to run ahead of you with scaling. If you keep your party well equipped and pay attention during combat, you shouldn't run into anything you can't overcome. Scarlet Grace is more balanced around the idea of keeping things at an appropriate level where combat is still a threat, but not to the point of being overwhelming. Once you slip up in terms of preparations, that's when the game will get you. And that's a lot more likely to happen in the early game than anywhere later. What I especially like about the combat though is how fair it is, and that's probably going to sound strange to people. In most JRPGs, your party and the enemy encounters work on different power skills. You'll both be effectively the same level unless you either grinded a ton or skipped a bunch of combat, but it wouldn't be accurate to say that you're anywhere near remotely the same strength. In most games, enemies exist to wear you down over time, providing you with a source of gold and experience necessary to climb up to a point where they stop wearing you down. If you fight an enemy encounter at nearly the same strength as your party, that wouldn't be too fun. Whoever moves first basically gets to win. Boss fights usually come closer to having the power of a party member, but even then there's only one of them and at least 3 of you. They might have more health to make up for it, but your party's combined raw power generally overwhelms most of the bosses. Scarlet Grace, however, is a lot more fair towards the enemies in this sense. Enemy encounters are nodes that you see on the map. There are no dungeons. You don't take items into combat and you heal back to full health after each encounter, even when fighting multiple encounters back to back. So both you and the enemy party are on a similar power curve, where you're both balanced to take each other out in this one fight. Enemies hit pretty hard, especially when they counter or interrupt attacks. Status effects and united attacks are also just as crippling when the enemy does them as when you do. But it's okay, because as soon as the battle is over, everyone is back to full health again. You especially notice how the skills are a lot more balanced between the parties when you're fighting against human opponents. They use the same weapons and techs as you do. These are often also the harder encounters, since some of the weapon techs can get pretty wild. Though the player still gets an edge in battle when it comes down to it, enemies don't get to have formations. Formations give you passive boosts to turn order and offensive or defensive power depending on what you're going with, even altering your BP growth and max. Formations also give you access to different benisons, which are a form of divine intervention that sometimes happens when the battle isn't going your way.
I grow weary of this.
You also get roles for each character, giving passive stat bonuses based on your weapon masteries. Then there's also how you decide your moves based on what the enemy has already chosen ahead of you, allowing you to strategize around what the enemy is doing instead of picking moves blindly the way that they have to do. So while things are a lot more fair than other JRPGs, it's still largely in favor of the player, but we're so used to games being balanced in favor of the player that the skills being balanced more evenly can be misread as the game being unfair. Though sometimes you do just get unlucky. But even then, the worst that could happen is that you lose the fight and either restart with a minor bonus or reload your save file. Scarlet Grace autosaves before every encounter, so you're not losing progress if you load a past save file.
All the help I can get.
There's a lot more I could go into with all of this, but if you need help, Scarlet Grace has an extensive tips menu with all the info you'd need. This is more than enough to figure out how combat works, what strategies to go for, or why anything functions the way that it does. It's useful and one of those things that helps place Scarlet Grace as the new beginner's entry in the franchise. Oh, and don't worry, I didn't spoil everything about how combat works. I didn't even go over the status effects or special rules. And those will really fuck you up. Something that I found interesting about all this design is that even the combat design comes back to tabletop design too. Reacting to visible enemy intent is pretty close to something like Slay the Spire's combat design. The BP system is close to how mana works in Hearthstone, even using similar visual representation. The entire system of counters and interruptions is a lot like secret spells in Hearthstone, again with a similar visual representation in the shape of question marks. Now, I'm not suggesting Hearthstone invented these mechanics or even that Kawazu has played it. If anything, I'm highlighting Hearthstone specifically because it's a video game card game. It's tabletop in video game form. It might even be a coincidence that they ended up using the same visual language, but they're both definitely coming from common ground.
Hey, that's kind of like a lighthouse.
Beyond combat, there's regular story events. You talk to someone, and they likely have to go somewhere and fight an enemy or talk to someone somewhere else. Not to brush over the story or anything, but that side of the game is really that simple. Most of the story events relate back to minor quests or side quests. The quests that make up the main chapters for the main characters are still broken down to smaller regional quests that are about the same problem at hand. These quests give you a better understanding of the setting, the world, and the characters living there, though I think it's the smaller side quests that really steal the show in Scarlet Grace. Like the quest with the incompetent mage girl who is desperate to get hired by one of the major houses. It weirdly reminds me of the Wheel of Time book somehow, with that main girl being Nynaeve, basically. The rumor quest that leads to repeated dead ends, almost feeling like an in-joke about obtuse old RPG quests. The same type that SaGa has been especially guilty about in the past and still kind of is guilty of to this day. There's a lot of comedy hidden away in the game that you hardly see anyone talk about. This isn't something that's new to the series, but Scarlet Grace does have a lot more of it. Besides the story events, you also have towns that give you access to various interactables. Towns in Scarlet Grace are basically just menus where you select the main options of what you want to do, which I'm more than fine with. If anything, this is what I wanted Romancing SaGa 2's main town to be already, so finally landing there is something I'm more than okay with. Most towns have a forge. Forges are the main way you get better equipment in Scarlet Grace. You typically don't find better swords or armor in dungeons, so instead you upgrade existing armor and weapons with the material rewards that you get from combat and quests. As you upgrade your gear, your forge rank increases. The higher your forge rank, the higher rank equipment you can upgrade to. Forge rank is global too, kind of like the shop rank system in Minstrel Song. The more you use the forge in any particular town, the more they see you as a valued customer, and the more of a discount you get on future forgeries. A lot of the larger towns also have a clearing, where you can sometimes meet a trainer. Trainers immediately raise a weapon skill rank of a party member, or the minstrel, who will usually give you lore relating to the area. Usually. Once you've reached a certain point in the game, you also unlock the option to produce goods based on the goods that you have with you. Every area has something they can produce, but only after trading it for other goods that another area produces. So starting with a stockpile of straw, you trade upwards, starting a worldwide development of industry and specialized trade between all the towns. And the more you trade, the more the towns will talk to you about what goes into the things that they create, as well as the culture surrounding the area and the troubles of the common folk that you'd normally never hear about in another JRPG. I never finished this questline, but I always liked making at least some trades to learn a little bit more about the setting. Now there are a couple of things I should warn about though. The first is that this is very clearly originally a Vita game made on a small budget. Visually, that's pretty obvious. There's a low number of assets that get reused all game long, and the overworld exploration is fairly simple, so the game relies mainly on its combat, with a combat system that is really great. But that also means that it's designed to be played on a handheld, which means fairly simple design that's easy to pick up and play, so you play it in short bursts. It's very easy to get burned out on Scarlet Grace, because you're not supposed to go all in for extended periods of time the way you do with major console games. And that's fine, but that's something you have to be aware of going in. There might be 4 playable characters, each with multiple different ending variations and multiple different final boss variations, but it's not a game you're supposed to replay back to back, more a game you come back to after a couple of months to play it again. I was going to do 3 playthroughs for this video, but I could feel the burnout settling in as I was nearing the end of my Leo playthrough. Keep in mind, I'd been playing Scarlet Grace for over 60 hours by that point. That doesn't mean I grew to dislike the game, but I could feel the need to move on and do something else by that point. Also, all of this said, the new Game Plus options are great. You choose just how much from the previous game you want to carry over, and every time you clear the game with a new character, they're added to the title screen. It's a really nice touch. Besides that, event flags can get crossed if you take on too many quests at once without clearing any. This is especially likely with the rumor-filled beach, but even more so as Leo since you can do all quests at once. It's not the biggest deal breaker or anything, it's pretty easy to rotate saves if you're really afraid of not being able to do everything in one run, but it is a thing that is very likely to happen. Personally, I never had too many major issues with event flags tripping over themselves. but I do know people who had the beach quest mess itself up while doing the Scarlet Shards quest. So, do I recommend SaGa Scarlet Grace? Yeah, this is probably the new best entry for beginners looking to get into SaGa. It has my all-time favorite combat in the series, a really rich setting that it pulls from, and an actual tips menu that tells you how to handle combat. It's a very good video game. Also, I have to say this, but that promotion I did with Square Enix where I was allowed to host a giveaway with game codes for Romancing SaGa 2, Romancing SaGa 3, and SaGa Scarlet Grace, or the promotional box they sent me for SaGa RE Universe, neither of these things influenced my opinions of this game. I normally don't take offers like these, but this is one of those situations where me not accepting it would be stranger than me saying yes to it. They initially offered me a game code for use on Steam, but I already owned the games anyway, so I figured that I might as well make it a giveaway to let other people try SaGa out for themselves, right? Speaking of experiencing things for yourselves, I asked the people supporting me on Patreon a question. In a game with a more open-ended structure, would you prefer a game that has an open map that lets you get immersed and lost, or a setting with lots of easily tracked quests for progress? Open map that lets you get lost won by a landslide. I guess I'm the same. I usually don't like big open maps, and I think it's because they've become these exercises in chasing map markers. Morrowind was the only one that really clicked with me, and in that game you just have a notebook and a big map. If you want to find something, you'll have to, well, actually find it. Most of my time with later Bethesda games, I ended up feeling like I was just aiming myself in the direction of a map marker and walking towards it without much care of what I'd find there, just the knowledge that the end of whatever chore I was doing would be at the destination. Anyway, I hope that this poll was a good way to gauge people's interest on the matter. Next time we're bringing a gun into that. As always, this video was brought to you by people supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen, vote in future polls, and get videos early, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp and I will, see ya.